The sound of the slap cut through the lobby like a dropped glass. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, clean enough that everyone heard it, unmistakable enough that no one questioned what it was. For a split second, time stalled. The piano music near the bar continued, oblivious. The chandelier lights stayed warm and golden. The marble floor reflected the moment back at itself, polished and indifferent. Nia Thompson's head turned slightly from the force, not dramatically, not violently, just enough to acknowledge impact. A breath passed, then another. Richard Hale stood inches from her, chest rising, jaw clenched, his hand still half raised as if it had acted on instinct rather than choice. His expression wasn't panic, it wasn't fear. It was irritation, like someone who believed he'd been pushed into correcting a nuisance. Around them, the lobby reacted in fragments. A woman near the concierge desk inhaled sharply. Someone near the elevators muttered, "Oh my God." A phone camera tilted higher. Another guest looked down at their shoes, suddenly fascinated by the pattern in the carpet. Security did nothing. The receptionist froze, hands hovering over the keyboard, eyes wide but empty, like someone watching something inevitable rather than wrong. Richard straightened his suit jacket and exhaled through his nose. "I warned you," he said, voice low but carrying. "You don't get to cause a scene in my hotel." Nia didn't touch her face. She didn't step back. Stood exactly where she was, shoulders squared, eyes forward. When she finally looked at him, there was no shock in her expression, no pleading, just stillness. "You just assaulted me," she said calmly. Richard scoffed. "You were refusing to leave private property. I was checking in." "Not anymore," he replied. "Security." The word landed heavier than the slap. Authority wrapped in policy, power disguised as procedure. One of the guards took a hesitant step forward, then stopped. He looked at Richard, then at Nia, then away. "Escort her out," Richard snapped. Nia slowly reached into her bag, not hurried, not dramatic. She pulled out her phone, glanced at the screen, and tapped it once. "Interesting," she said softly. 9 minutes. Richard laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "What does that even mean?" She met his eyes. "Nothing you need to worry about." That answer irritated him more than if she'd shouted, "Get her out." The guard finally moved closer, but he didn't touch her. He didn't have to. The pressure was everywhere, in the silence, in the watching eyes, in the certainty that resistance would only be reframed as aggression. Nia took one last look around the lobby. She noticed the staff who wouldn't meet her gaze, the guests pretending to scroll, the cameras mounted discreetly above the columns. She nodded once. "I'll walk." Richard turned away before she finished speaking, already done with her, already convinced the problem had been handled. As she stepped toward the exit, her reflection passed through the mirrored walls, composed, controlled, unbroken. If anyone expected tears or shaking or a scene, they were disappointed. She moved like someone used to enduring rooms where she wasn't expected to belong. Outside, the city air felt cooler. Nia stopped just beyond the doors and stood there, listening to the muted sounds of the lobby behind her. The piano continued. Life continued. She checked her phone again. 8 minutes, 30 seconds. She pressed it to her ear. "They confirmed the time stamp?" she asked quietly. A voice answered on the other end, calm, professional. "Yes, audio and video are secure." "Good," she said. "I'll wait." Inside the Regency Crown Hotel, Richard Hale poured himself a glass of water at the staff station, hands still trembling slightly, though he would never admit it. He told himself what he always told himself, that he had prevented a disruption, protected the brand, upheld standards. That people like her tested boundaries because no one enforced them. He glanced around. "Why is everyone starring?" he barked. No one answered. The receptionist swallowed. "Sir, what if she files a complaint?" Richard waved it off. "About what?" She trespassed. "She caused a disturbance. We handled it." The words felt familiar, rehearsed. He'd used them before. 10 years earlier, when a guest accused a supervisor of harassment. 5 years earlier, when a bellhop quietly disappeared after questioning scheduling practices. Each time the system absorbed the shock and reset itself. Complaints were processed. Narratives were managed. Nothing touched him because nothing ever did. Back outside, Nia leaned against the stone column near the entrance, eyes closed briefly, not in weakness but in calculation. She thought of her grandmother who taught her that dignity wasn't loud. That power didn't always announce itself. That sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was remain calm when someone expected you to break. She opened her eyes as headlights swept across the entrance. Black sedans pulled up one by one. Doors opened. Inside the lobby, the mood shifted before anyone understood why. Conversations lowered. The concierge straightened. Richard felt it, a subtle pressure change like weather turning. A man in a tailored suit entered first, scanning the room with practiced precision. Behind him, a woman with a tablet. Then another man, older, silver-haired, unmistakably executive. Richard's stomach tightened. The receptionist whispered, "Sir, those look like—" "I know what they look like," Richard muttered, already stepping forward, smile forming automatically. "Good evening. Welcome to the Regency Crown. I'm the operations manager." The man held up a hand. "We know who you are." Behind them, the doors opened again. Nia walked in. The room went completely silent. Richard turned, confusion flashing across his face as he saw her re-enter, calm, unescorted, unafraid. For a fraction of a second, he felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty. The silver-haired man stepped aside. "Ms. Thompson," he said respectfully. Every eye in the lobby snapped toward her. She nodded once. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Richard's smile collapsed. She walked past him without looking at him and stopped at the center of the lobby where the slap had landed minutes earlier. "I believe," she said evenly, "we have some things to discuss. Before we continue, if stories like this matter to you, please consider subscribing. I put a lot of time and care into bringing these stories to life, and your support truly helps me keep telling them." Nia turned slowly, finally facing Richard. "Mr. Hale," she said, "you asked me to leave your hotel." She paused. "Now I'm asking you to stay." The executive spread out subtly, not blocking exits, not posturing, just present. Witnesses. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. His mind raced for explanations, for authority, for someone to defer to, but the usual hierarchy felt suddenly inverted. "What is this?" he demanded. "Who are you people?" Nia met his gaze, her voice steady, unraised. "My name is Nia Thompson," she said, "and for the last 9 minutes you've been explaining to me exactly how this hotel operates." The lobby held its breath. "Do you think moments like this happen because of one bad person, or because the system allows it?" Richard Hale felt the eyes on him before he understood why they suddenly mattered. The lobby, which had always obeyed him through habit and hierarchy, no longer felt like his. The executives hadn't raised their voices. They hadn't announced authority. They simply stood there, calm and observant, as if the building itself had been placed under quiet inspection. Richard cleared his throat and straightened his shoulders. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, defaulting to the tone he used when smoothing over complaints from donors or bored guests. "This woman caused a disturbance. My staff followed protocol." Nia didn't respond immediately. She turned instead to the receptionist. "May I ask your name?" The young woman hesitated, glancing at Richard. "Emily," she said softly. "Emily," Nia repeated. "Did I have a reservation?" Emily swallowed. "Yes, the Thompson Executive Suite. It was flagged." "Flagged how?" Emily's eyes flicked back to Richard. He stepped forward. "We flag reservations all the time," he said quickly. "Security reasons, high-profile events." Nia nodded once. "And when I arrived—" "You didn't present identification," Richard said. "I wasn't asked for it," Nia replied. Silence stretched. Richard's jaw tightened. "Regardless," he said, "she became confrontational." "Did I?" Nia asked, still calm. A murmur rippled through the guests. One man near the bar shifted uncomfortably. Another woman lowered her phone, then raised it again. The older executive spoke for the first time, his voice even. "Mr. Hale, please explain why security did not intervene when physical contact occurred." Richard bristled. "She was trespassing." "Trespass does not authorize assault," the executive replied. "Nor does it explain your language." Richard felt heat rise in his neck. "You people always—" He stopped himself, realizing too late that the words had nearly escaped again. "I mean, there's a pattern during conferences." Nia looked at him then, really looked at him, not with anger but with something closer to documentation. "A pattern of what?" she asked. Richard hesitated. The answer he wanted to give was the one he'd been rewarded for all his career, the coded language, the shared assumptions. But the room had changed. "Disruptions," he said finally. "Guests who don't belong." The words hung there, exposed. Nia turned to the executives. "You hear that?" No one nodded. No one disagreed. They simply listened. Richard felt suddenly alone. He tried another tactic. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said. If there's an issue, file a report. We'll review internally. Internally, Nia repeated. Like the last 3 complaints against this property. Richard froze. What complaints? The concierge who resigned without explanation, she said. The bellhop terminated for attendance issues after submitting a written concern. The guest last year who was escorted out during a charity gala. Richard laughed, brittle. Coincidences? Nia nodded again. That's what the report said. The executives began moving, not dramatically but deliberately. One spoke quietly into a phone. Another opened a tablet. The atmosphere thickened with process. Richard tried to reassert control. You can't conduct an investigation in my lobby, he snapped. This is private property. Nia's voice didn't rise. It belongs to the corporation, she said, and so does your contract. That word landed hard. Contract, not title, not authority, agreement, conditional. Richard felt his confidence waver. He turned to the guests. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, forcing a smile, thank you for your patience. Everything is under control. A woman near the elevator spoke up, her voice shaking. I saw you hit her. Richard's smile vanished. Ma'am, please. I recorded it, she said. So did I, someone else added. The security guard shifted his weight. Sir, he murmured to Richard, maybe we should. Stay where you are, Richard snapped. Nia watched the guard with interest. Did you receive training on de-escalation? She asked him gently. He nodded. Yes, ma'am. Did I appear violent? He hesitated. No. Did I threaten anyone? No. Then why didn't you intervene? The guard looked at Richard. I was instructed not to. The answer was quiet but devastating. Nia turned back to Richard. That's escalation, she said. Not a mistake, a choice. Richard felt cornered. He reached for the language that had always protected him. This is harassment, he said. You're creating a hostile work environment. The executives exchanged glances. For whom? One asked. For my staff, Richard said quickly. They're being intimidated. Nia's gaze swept the room. Emily, she said again. Do you feel intimidated by me? Emily shook her head, tears welling. No. Do you feel intimidated by Mr. Hale? Emily hesitated longer this time. The silence answered for her. Richard exhaled sharply. This is absurd. He turned to Nia. Who do you think you are? She studied him for a moment as if deciding how much truth to offer at once. Someone who wanted to see how power behaves when it thinks it's unobserved, she said. The words unsettled him. He scoffed. You came here looking for trouble. No, she replied. I came here looking for truth. The executives began asking questions, measured, methodical, staffing ratios, complaint logs, incident reports. Richard answered defensively, his voice growing sharper each time. The more he spoke, the clearer the pattern became. Rules applied downward, protection flowed upward. The guests watched, no longer passive. A man in a suit muttered, "This is unbelievable." A woman whispered, "About time." Richard felt the room slipping. He leaned toward Nia, lowering his voice. Let's take this private, he said. We can resolve it quietly. She met his eyes. Quietly is how this survived, she said. Not today. The executives conferred briefly. One of them addressed the room. We will be conducting a formal review effective immediately, he announced. Operations will continue, but management decisions are suspended pending investigation. Richard stared. You can't just, we can, the executive replied. And we are. Security shifted positions, not to restrain but to observe. The staff looked at Richard differently now, seeing not authority but exposure. He felt humiliation creep in, unfamiliar and unwelcome. This isn't over, he said to Nia, trying to reclaim some ground. People like you think you can walk in and destroy reputations. Nia's voice softened. Reputations don't collapse, she said. They're revealed. The lobby buzzed with quiet conversations. Phones continued recording. The narrative was no longer his to manage. Richard stood there, trapped between policy and consequence, realizing for the first time that the system he trusted was being asked to explain itself out loud. Have you ever watched someone abuse power and felt completely helpless? The investigation began almost immediately, though Richard Hale tried to frame it as routine. Reports were filed, statements collected, and interviews conducted with staff and guests. He insisted everything was being exaggerated, that Nia Thompson had somehow misrepresented the situation. The lobby cameras had captured the slap, yes, but he argued context mattered, that she had provoked him. At first, a few junior staff believed him. After all, Richard had been in charge for years. He had a reputation for decisiveness, for knowing how to keep the hotel running smoothly, and for protecting the interests of investors. His words carried weight, but the more statements were cross-checked, the more contradictions emerged. Guests remembered the slap. Phones confirmed it. Staff members, previously reluctant to speak, quietly admitted they had been told to stand by, to ignore her presence. Each confession, each recorded detail chipped away at the narrative Richard tried to construct. Despite his protests, the hotel board moved swiftly. Richard was asked to step aside temporarily while the incident was formally reviewed. He complied, but his compliance was laced with resentment, a simmering belief that he was being unfairly targeted. He leaned on excuses of misinterpretation and miscommunication, asserting that the entire affair had been blown out of proportion. He suggested that Nia had orchestrated this encounter, implying manipulation, even though no evidence supported such claims. The lobby remained tense, staff whispered among themselves, and the guests sensed an underlying drama unfolding beyond their understanding. Nia, meanwhile, maintained her composure. She never raised her voice, never demanded immediate retribution. Instead, she focused on observation, letting the evidence speak. Her presence alone was a subtle assertion of power. She reviewed reports, watched the security footage, and compared statements to identify inconsistencies. There was no vindictiveness in her actions, only precise attention to detail. At one point, Richard attempted to rally sympathetic staff. "You know me," he said to a few who hesitated to speak openly. "I've looked out for you. This is just a misunderstanding. Don't let her turn this against us." Some nodded reluctantly, others stayed silent. No one committed fully to his narrative because the evidence, the silent witness of cameras and guest testimonies, told a different story. The hotel board convened a hearing. Richard appeared, impeccably dressed, presenting himself as wronged, frustrated, and dignified. He argued that physical contact had been minor, that Nia's demeanor was provocative, and that she had disrupted normal operations. He even suggested that some staff had encouraged her confrontation. The board listened politely, asked a few clarifying questions, and allowed him to speak without interruption. At the conclusion, they delivered their decision. Richard would face a formal reprimand, receive sensitivity training, and a notation would be placed in his record. Publicly, this was framed as justice. Nia's role was understated, portrayed as a standard investigation, a necessary measure to protect the hotel's reputation. The media reported a minor managerial issue resolved through internal review. The lobby cameras, though known to executives, were not released to the public. For those outside the walls, the story was neat, contained, and seemingly resolved. But within the hotel, something had shifted. Richard's authority was undermined. Staff no longer approached him with the same deference. Guests subtly questioned his decisions. The executives assigned to oversee the property moved through the floors with quiet authority, documenting every procedure. Behind closed doors, whispers circulated about prior incidents, the timing of complaints, and the pattern of escalation. Though Richard outwardly retained his title, he felt the weight of scrutiny pressing against every choice. Nia observed it all, quietly nodding the cracks. She didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply recorded, analyzed, and waited for the right time to act decisively. The slap had been the spark, the exposure of weakness the proof. The board's intervention, framed as justice, was only a temporary measure. The system had momentarily acknowledged wrongdoing, but it had not yet corrected the deeper patterns of abuse. Richard remained protected in some ways, shielded by his history and the inertia of the institution. The tension continued to simmer. Staff and guests alike sensed that the resolution was superficial, that real accountability had not yet arrived. Richard's confidence was fractured. Nia's calm persisted. She walked through the lobby daily, observing, listening, and cataloging every detail, knowing that the true reckoning would require patience, precision, and undeniable evidence. The public could be appeased with the reprimand. The staff could be reassured with procedural changes. The media could be fed a story of internal review concluded. But the truth, the pattern, the choices, the systemic abuse remained. and Nia was determined to make sure it would be revealed fully, eventually, in a way that could not be ignored. Did you believe justice had been served here, or did something feel wrong? The reprieve was brief. While the board's reprimand seemed like a victory, Nia soon realized that the system she was challenging had layers designed to protect itself. The hotel's human resources department began sending subtle signals. Policies were referenced in ways that twisted accountability. Emails hinted at optics and brand protection, and casual conversations reinforced the narrative that the incident had already been resolved. Media outlets fed carefully curated statements, framed the story as a minor managerial dispute. Headlines read, "Hotel manager reprimanded after guest complaint and internal review concludes without major disruption." None mentioned the slap, the intimidation, or the history of selective enforcement. The narrative was sanitized. Nia watched from her office suite, reading each article, feeling the weight of institutional manipulation. Every statement, every press release, every carefully worded internal memo was a layer of betrayal. It was subtle, almost polite, but deliberate. She reflected on her own career, the years spent navigating corporate bureaucracy, and the countless times she had seen truth buried beneath protocol and policy. She remembered her first internship, the senior manager who dismissed complaints about harassment as overly sensitive and not worth the optics. She remembered her mother's warnings. The system protects those who play by its rules, even if those rules are wrong. As days passed, Nia saw the patterns repeating. Staff who had spoken up cautiously were now being questioned indirectly, isolated, or reassigned. Emily, the receptionist, was suddenly overworked. Her schedule shifted without explanation. The security guard who had hesitated to intervene received an urgent compliance memo implying he had acted incorrectly, though no action had actually been taken. Richard, though publicly reprimanded, received a private message from a senior executive assuring him that his position was still valued and that the incident shouldn't interfere with ongoing projects. The protection of powerful interests was clear. The system was designed to absorb shocks, redistribute blame, and maintain appearances. Nia felt the weight of isolation. Her calm, deliberate approach now faced resistance not from one person, but from layers of bureaucracy that refused to acknowledge full accountability. Emails from legal counsel reminded her that any misstep could be construed as overreach. Internal communications stressed confidentiality and risk management. Nia realized that while she had exposed one act of abuse, the institution itself was adept at gaslighting, reframing events, and burying inconvenient truths. Even allies within the hotel hesitated, wary of repercussions. Nia reflected on the historical injustices she had studied, the countless times systems had shielded perpetrators while punishing victims. She felt the low point acutely, the pressure of fighting against not just an individual but a structure that had been fortified over decades. She spent long nights in the empty corridors of the Regency Crown, observing silent rooms, nodding security cameras, listening to distant conversations. Every detail was a clue, a piece of the puzzle she needed to dismantle the systemic betrayal. The more she watched, the clearer it became. Accountability would not come from public statements or superficial reprimands. It would require exposing the patterns, documenting every misstep, and ensuring that truth could not be silenced. The low point was profound. Her strategy, patience, and intelligence were tested against the inertia of an institution that prioritized reputation over justice, optics over ethics, and compliance over morality. Yet, even in this dark moment, Nia's resolve remained unbroken. She understood that the fight was not just for herself, but for every person who had been diminished, overlooked, or harmed by the unchecked power of those who believed they were untouchable. Would you have had the strength to keep fighting after this? Nia Thompson moved with quiet precision, assembling her allies one by one. Legal counsel, senior executives loyal to the corporation's core values, and even former staff members who had once been silenced began to emerge from the shadows. Each brought a piece of the truth. internal emails revealing directives to ignore certain complaints, timestamps from security footage proving that multiple incidents had been mishandled, and digital records showing the selective enforcement of policies. Documents were collated meticulously, cross-referenced, and stored securely. Nothing could be dismissed as anecdotal. The evidence was undeniable. The first public ripple came through a carefully drafted report circulated to the hotel board and corporate leadership. It summarized the pattern of abuse, the systemic failure, and the risks to the company's integrity. The language was calm, factual, and unemotional, leaving little room for dismissal. Richard Hale and other implicated managers attempted to respond, framing their actions as protocol, insisting that no malice had been intended, and suggesting that the situation had been exaggerated. But each claim was contradicted by timestamp communications, witness statements, and internal records. The truth was structured, irrefutable. As the executives reviewed the comprehensive evidence, they began to grasp the scope of the problem. It wasn't just a single slap, a single mismanaged check-in, or a moment of poor judgment. It was a consistent, documented pattern of intimidation, selective rule enforcement, and institutional complicity. The board convened a private meeting, this time with Nia at the center, presenting each detail methodically. There was no shouting, no theatrics, just clarity, precision, and undeniable documentation. Richard and others attempted to deflect, but the records left no room for maneuver. Staff who had once hesitated to speak now gave corroborating testimony. Guests who had recorded events came forward, their videos synchronized with the internal footage. Media teams, previously fed only sanitized statements, were provided carefully controlled disclosures. The story shifted overnight. Headlines changed from minor managerial issues to systemic abuse and corporate accountability. Hotel manager fired after evidence of abuse emerges. Read 1. CEO steps in to expose institutional corruption. Read another. Richard Hale, once confident in his immunity, was dismissed immediately. Other staff implicated in failing to uphold ethical standards were reassigned or terminated. Policies were rewritten. Oversight mechanisms were introduced. The hotel's operations no longer functioned under the pretense of appearances alone. Justice, for the first time, was tangible, yet Nia's approach was not vengeful. There were no public shamming campaigns, no humiliating confrontations. The reckoning was calm, procedural, and thorough, an orchestration of truth rising above power and manipulation. She observed quietly, ensuring that systemic flaws were corrected, and that accountability extended beyond the individual to the structure that had allowed abuse to thrive. In the following weeks, staff regained confidence. Guests noticed a subtle but meaningful change. The lobby felt safer, more respectful, and more honest. Nia continued to monitor, ensuring that vigilance replaced complacency. The system had been challenged and reshaped, not destroyed, and the precedent for justice had been established. Silence, truth, and evidence had done what intimidation could not. And through it all, Nia remained composed, the calm at the center of a storm, demonstrating that dignity, patience, and unwavering adherence to principle could prevail over entrenched abuse. What part of this story stayed with you the most, and why?